When you care about current affairs, it's on the Oshow.
Welcome to the Oshow, Canada's current affairs show with strong opinions. I'm your host, Laura Babcock. And if you've been paying attention to the US and Canada this week, you'll know that our relationship, our long friendship, is under some really strange stress. In fact, we have American pundits who are doing shows on it, talking about the fact that this represents a break, possibly, in our long-standing relationship. And there are media from around the world that are analyzing it, even psychoanalyzing the relationship between Trump and Trudeau. So how did it get so bad so fast? After Trudeau flew down on Trump's invitation to have that dinner at Mar-a-Lago after the tariff threat, Trump decided to poke Trudeau. And some people think it's just merely trolling, because that's what Trump likes to do on social media. But other people take it a little bit more seriously. It kind of smacks of manifest destiny, a 19th century doctrine, where America felt that it should have all the parts of America. And is that what Trump is signaling here? Or is he just having some fun to maybe get the MAGA base up here in Canada, all 13% of it all riled up? Well, my guest I had to have on this rare evening Oshow has been in the US a fair bit, helped to cover the US election and the debate for CNN. He's been on Fox. He has really kind of been in the belly of the beast, if you will. He has met with a lot of the leaders in the US and even some of the people who might be in Trump's cabinet. And when I saw his response to Trump's statement about Trudeau being the governor of the great state of Canada, he said, well, that's mildly terrifying. So welcome to the program, Wyatt Sharpe. He is the host of the Wyatt Sharpe Show. And if you're wondering why he looks so young, it's because he is. He is 15 years old and started his journalism career during the pandemic. It's a thrill to have you here on the O Show.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, I was interested in your hot take when you saw Trump's social post, because that was my hot take. And
yeah.
Why did you come at it from that perspective? Why is it mildly terrifying to you?
Well, and it's interesting because I was looking through the comments after I made that post, and generally speaking on social media, I like to make kind of down the middle commentary or just report the facts. But this one was a little bit different because it's not very often, as a Canadian journalist who likes to talk about and cover American politics, do both of our two countries directly kind of intercept in a story. And so this was particularly, as I said, interesting because the comments in that post were even from some people on the left side of the political spectrum who you would expect to also be kind of, a little bit puzzled by this statement. They were not too thrilled with the statement I made, and it was a little bit strange at first glance anyways. But I think a lot of people were frustrated with the fact that people are kind of giving this statement so much attention. And that kind of happens with a lot of the different things that Donald Trump says, is they're just so absurd. And then as a result, people and the press talk about them and they kind of only further amplify these types of stories. So I kind of understood that afterwards. But I think why this is so significant is not necessarily the direct threat that people are talking about, Trump wanting to take over Canada. But it also speaks to just kind of how unseriously he takes our country and kind of the lack of respect that he has for Canada as a country, for our governmental institutions and what have you. And so that's kind of where I was coming at it from. It wasn't necessarily the belief or potentiality that Trump could do something more seriously. At least I hope that's not what will happen. But either way, it just seems as if the president-elect, we haven't had it before where he's been making even mildly jokes about something of this nature. And so I think people kind of unanimously are a little bit puzzled by it.
Why it was more alarming to me is because I've seen the CPAC coverage. Why aren't we in Canada calling Trudeau a communist, sort of laying the groundwork for this would be justified. We would, they would greet us with roses or whatever if we went in there and freed them from this communist. That rhetoric's been out there. It's extreme, no doubt about it. But then we heard during the actual election campaign when Trump was at an event at his golf course in California, where he talked about the droughts and said, Canada's got a big faucet. We just need to turn on. And when it comes to sort of almost an envying of our natural resources, I get a little bit more concerned. It's not just in this moment, him kind of ridiculing Canada for some trade negotiation. There's been a history of this. And then you got Jesse on the 5 talking about, well, why aren't, we in Canada? Why isn't it a state? Trump lays the groundwork, makes it ridiculous and a joke, and then he normalizes it in the public consciousness.
Yeah, and I mean, to pick up on the last thing you mentioned, it's interesting. I think simply because half the country decided to vote for him, it has become normalized, but that doesn't take away from the fact that so much of what he's saying is just patently false or is in some cases misinformation. But yeah, I mean, in terms of what you were mentioning there, like I think at this point, Canada has a lot of resources that the United States needs as well. And so just as easily as people like Jesse Waters, will be sitting on Fox News Channel and make a comment like the one you were referring to, Canada, as we saw in 2017, just as easily could make the threat of retaliatory tariffs on things like wood, on things like oil, minerals, metal products, and then agricultural products too, like grain. Like there's a lot of things that I think Donald Trump perhaps knows, but he just doesn't feel the need to address it because he knows he comes across as kind of this powerful type figure to people in Canada who don't really know any better. I think people, even speaking from my generation and my peers, uh, automatically assume in many ways that Canada is kind of behind the United States in terms of just overall standing because we've been, taught that for so long, whether it be in school or whether it be from things that people see on social media. And then again, I think it speaks to the idea of everyone expects what the president of the United States says to be true because they're the holder of the highest office in all of North America in some cases. And, with Donald Trump, that just isn't the case. And so we're really going to have to dig a little bit deeper. But I think in many ways, I'm not sure how much different it'll be than kind of the 2017 dispute that we saw similarly when Trump first got elected, where it was a lot of the same types of threats that he was making. And then at the time, we, as Canada, as you'll know, had Chrystia Freeland, who was kind of acting as our negotiator. And I'm interested to see how it kind of plays out without having her, because I always, when people ask me about Chrystia Freeland, as, unpopular in some cases as she may be, that was definitely one of the things that I think will stand out in her kind of negotiating abilities. And so Canada, without having her in kind of that lead role, I'll be interested to see kind of what we're able to do in terms of countering some of these threats that he's making.
I'm hearing rhetoric that we've never heard, right? And I'm seeing a resource crisis in the world more pronounced than ever in my lifetime. And so looking at a president of the United States who, to your point, has been, and Daniel Dale, another Canadian who's down there, who is doing a ton of fact checking, he lies like 30,000 times in his presidency or something. People can choose what they want to believe from Trump to fit their own preference, right? But I'm concerned that this might not be a one term. If they can decide that they don't want to hold a free and fair election, this might be turned into more of a legacy thing, more of a family dynasty thing. Do you have any of those concerns, given that you've met so many of the players and you've interviewed so many of them? Like, are you feeling a sense of this is just a lot of show and a lot of smoke and it'll probably be pretty normal? Or are you feeling like, no, I've met some of these people and they're serious. They seriously want to change things dramatically?
Yeah, here's what I'll say about that is I think Trump world is kind of divided into multiple different kind of sections. I think there's the people who are genuinely serious about doing things like you're referencing, but I also think that there's very policy focused people who just cannot in conscience support a Democrat because it goes against what they stand for. And as a result, they would rather support Donald Trump because policy wise, he is more related to what, they are looking at. And so, one example is someone named Hogan Gidley, who was a press secretary in his administration, who's been a mentor to me and who has helped me in, a variety of different ways. And whenever you talk to him, you never get a sense that I don't want to use the word crazy, but you never get the sense that he is like extreme. I guess I'll use that word. But then if you talk to other people in Trump world, like George Santos, for example, or Matt Gaetz, like these are people who very much are rehearsed in what they're saying. They're very scripted in what they're saying. I remember being in Atlanta on the spin room floor after the first presidential debate and seeing all of the spinners that were out there talking to the media and the press. And it was a good example of kind of this contrast that I'm speaking of. You saw when I interviewed Matt Gaetz there, for example, he was like, I imagine during the debate, I can picture him like probably studying different lines that he's going to come out and say to the press. But then you had people like there's a senator named Eric Schmidt from Oklahoma, and he was very genuine to talk to. He talked to me for probably 5 to 10 minutes. He was answering my questions, and he had a lot more policy in his answers, where some of these people tend to use talking points a little bit more. So, in regards to your question, I think there is a certain, I mean, we've seen just the other day, for example, Kimberly Guilfoyle, who has been a longtime member of the Trump family, now be appointed as ambassador to Greece. You saw relatives of Jared Kushner get appointed to high level positions within the presidency. So I think certainly there is something to be said about all of these family members getting appointments, some of which are perhaps qualified from previous things that they've done. But then just in terms of the cabinet appointments as a whole as well, you have a lot of qualified people who are being appointed, like Mike Waltz is an example, the national security advisor. He served on the House Intelligence Committee. But then, you have some perhaps not as qualified people, the likes of Pete Hegseth for defense secretary, who, is, I'm sure, a nice person, but he's been appointed without having any intelligence experience, aside from actually being in the army. He hasn't done a whole lot on the defense front. A lot of people were maybe saying he'd be better suited for like Veterans Affairs or something. And so there's just a lot of kind of behind the scenes details, I would say, that people are kind of puzzled by and are wondering how it's going to kind of shake out.
I'm taking from listening to you that it's more of a nuanced picture in Washington
Mm-hmm.
than the sexy bits that get picked up and go viral that everyone's obsessed with, right? I mean, I can't remember ever a cabinet setting up a cabinet where everyone knows the names of the players and follows their bios and their fights, right? So it's a show like no show we've ever seen, and that is incredibly captivating for people. But it sounds to me like you're saying that there is a mix of people who are still about policy, who still want to see their democratic norms in place, that still expect there to be elections, it's a little less about the Matt Gaetzes and a little bit more about, as you're saying, some of these other people who you've had a chance to interview.
Yeah, I definitely think that's right. I also think I would say if we're thinking about people like I'm trying to think of some example, like Nikki Haley, for example, who is quite smart when it comes to foreign policy, and she had said during her primary campaign that she wasn't going to take as center stage of a role in the presidential campaign with President Trump, and then she was speaking at the RNC. Behind the scenes, people were saying she was working for a position after she dropped out of the race. And so it just speaks to the fact that like it's Donald Trump's Republican Party now, not just the Republican Party as a whole. The party of kind of John McCain and Mitt Romney is no longer existent. And so people who felt more at home in those types of Republican parties are very much looking for an alternative. You hear the term kind of politically homeless being used a lot right now. And so I think it's just people are looking at the United States as a binary political choice right now, and they have to choose between one or the other. And even people who have come out, and I was watching MSNBC the other day, and they had someone who's always been a Trump supporter, a former Republican who has become an ever Trumper, and then there was someone in between who, after January 6th and after the insurrection, spoke out about Donald Trump, but has since went back to Donald Trump because of what he said the last 4 years has been like, a declining economy and what have you. And so I think people just as a whole right now, as you said, a very nuanced type of approach. And I don't even really know if there's necessarily a straight answer, because I think everyone is just kind of, it's unfortunate, but I think a lot of people in politics in DC right now are looking at it from the perspective of, how can I maintain my own place in this Republican Party? What does that mean for my career path? And what role does Donald Trump play in that?
Right, trying to see if they can be in the court of the king, as it were,
Yeah, exactly.
Awards or whatever. So let's talk a little bit, if you can, about your meta-analysis of your responses that you got on X to your tweet, because as you said, you're nonpartisan, you're a journalist, you put out more of an editorial take on Trump's thing, and rather than get upset about some of the pushback, you're looking at it going, I think that people are kind of, I love the fact that you look at it like that. You have to, if you're, have a journalism background, you can't get personally upset by everything that happens on social. But given that you're 15 and social media, particularly X, has changed dramatically since Elon took it over, a lot of people are moving off that platform and Blue Sky and Threads and other places. What is your, I don't want to ask for advice per se, but what is your take on the impact of those platforms vis-a-vis, what's really happening when you go to these conventions and you do these interviews with policymakers and with the politicians?
Yeah, I mean, for me, like I started getting involved in journalism and politics, and I've at a time when Twitter was like in kind of its peak, so to speak. Like Elon Musk wasn't the owner yet, over the course of the pandemic, people were turning to it for updates on what was happening. And, obviously with social media, there's always a little bit of misinformation, but I found it to be kind of generally trustworthy. It was a nice way for me to share my content with people, but also for people to share ideas with me on, potential interviewees and what have you. But then, yeah, as you said, like Elon Musk bought the platform, and then Twitter, for example, or X has kind of been in like a steady decline, so to speak. And even people now I've noticed are losing followers in some cases because people, as you said, are going to these apps like Blue Sky, and other platforms. For me personally, it definitely played a big role, social media, in terms of helping me get to where I am now. Now I'm doing a little bit of stuff on like cable news and satellite news and stuff as well. So I'm not necessarily like as concerned about the Twitter part as I would have been, say, like a year or two ago when it was basically all of my, journalism and on all of what I was doing. I would say too, like after the election, I had a show that I was doing on what's called the News Forum in Canada, and it was specifically on the US election. And then I organized a conference style event that took up some time as well. So right now I'm kind of maybe going back a little bit to the social media stuff up until I find kind of my next endeavor on TV or whatever the case may be. But I think it goes in surges, and certainly Elon Musk bought the platform, and the decline, as I said, it's been kind of going down in terms of its value and in terms of what people are getting out of it. And I'll just say this lastly, like when you go on, at least me personally on X right now, I noticed that like a lot of my recommended feed is not what it used to be, in the sense of it used to be more like politics driven content similar to the types of content that I was posting. Whereas now, through whatever changes they made to the algorithm, it's seemingly just whatever it feels like showing me. And so sometimes I'll get a video of a baby, sometimes I'll get a video of a dog. And like sometimes I mean, as funny as those are, I mean, that's what TikTok's for in some case. So, it certainly is changing a lot. And I think at this point, I'm just kind of, as everyone is, waiting to see where it goes.
Okay, so let me ask you this then, just pivoting to Canadian politics for a little bit. And I know you've interviewed Trudeau. I don't know if you've had a chance to interview Poilievre, but
Yes.
One of the things that I've certainly noticed is when I post content from other shows that I do in mainstream media or whatever, if it is critical of the right wing in this country, I get just inundated with paid bots. I mean, it's clear because they use the same language. Often there's no grammar there. It doesn't seem like it's even, people are writing it in other countries, perhaps. So, I mean, if you're not aware of that behind the scenes happening in our politics, it can drive people out of the conversation. Do you worry about that? Do you worry about a sort of culture of intimidation online that can push people and say, I'm disengaging, which then can make people less engaged in the actual election, which is, a threat to our democracy?
Yeah, I worry about it in the sense of, let me do this in stages, in the sense of, I think people who are just your average everyday working person, they don't really have time to talk about politics on social media in some cases too. They're not as concerned about it as, people like, say, you or I would be. And so they're not really getting their news from there necessarily as much as other people are anyways. Maybe they're getting it from traditional media sources, or maybe the odd time they'll go on social media, but not necessarily, that's not the group that I'm concerned about. I would say I'm more concerned about my generation in the sense of they're scrolling TikTok in some cases hours a day, and they're being taught that politics is almost this game, so to speak, where it's like okay, or it's expected to go back and forth in this kind of hyper partisan way. And they don't know any better because that's kind of what they've been taught politics is, whereas in reality, it should be more about kind of public policy making and what have you. So I would say that's kind of where my concern with that in particular lies. And then, yeah, just moving forward, I think if we can try and amend that or change that in some ways, I think social media is a good place for people to learn about politics, but at the same time, trying to educate young people that it is more of like a talking point platform than places to read policy documents, for example.
So I love that aspiration. And just thinking about my daughter, she, has grown up with her parents always doing politics and media, right? So she kind of wasn't going to be her bag. But she said the breaking point for her was the last election around reproductive rights for women in the US. She just couldn't bear to stay disengaged. She was wanting me to ask you if you had a breaking point or if it was just your overwhelming curiosity, or if there was something during the pandemic where you're like, no, I need answers. I need to get in there. But she also she uses TikTok and she watches the gamesmanship of the debate, the dumbing down of it, the fact that it gets so crazy so fast on whatever stories come out. And so she wants to kind of invest her time in kind of correcting it or giving context to it. But is that the way about it, Wyatt? Or do you have, other than like the summit you did of future leaders or future politics, what do you think is the way to get people who are younger engaged in the policy and the importance of politics and not just this crazy game?
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned about reproductive rights, because even people I go to school with, because I'm still in high school, they specifically girls were making a lot of references and expressing a lot of concerns over the course of the past American election. And I go to a Canadian boarding school. I'm a day student, but there's a lot of boarding students who are there from the United States. And so some of the girls were expressing a lot of concern about what this means for them. And they're in a unique position where they're going to a school in Canada where abortion is still fully legal. But some of the states where they're coming from, it's in the process of becoming illegal. And so there was a lot of concern there. And so I think for some people, that's kind of their turning point, as you said, where they can find a specific issue and then they advocate on that. And that's kind of the basis of their activism. In my case, it was more general in terms of like it was over the course of the pandemic. I tell the story of like I was always watching cable news and I was seeing whether it be Dr. Tam at the time or other, medical professionals on TV, the prime minister providing medical updates, reassurances to people, and I was kind of forming my own questions in my own mind about what was happening. And so I ended up reaching out to some of the people who you would see on TV just with my own questions. In some cases it was via email, sometimes it was via Zoom. And then eventually I started having more like routine Zoom conversations, and that's kind of how the interview idea was formed. Just out of a sense of, again, curiosity. And then like the last part of it, civic engagement overall, I would say it's important to first teach people about, civic engagement as a whole, what it means to be engaged, different levels of government, and how government itself actually works. And then they can use that knowledge to understand how they themselves can kind of best affect change on, again, a policy issue that is relevant and related to them. I think a lot of it also comes in the form of education. And so whether it be like grade 5 curriculum or the now mandatory Ontario grade 10 civics credit that I'm taking right now. Things like that, for example, I think also are a nice way to encourage people to get involved. But that was one thing I noticed too, actually, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about this with the event that I was doing. It was, a whole bunch of students who were coming and they were learning about politics, but some of these politicians were making references to policy things that they were doing. But some of the students didn't themselves actually know a whole lot about these government systems that were allowing these politicians to invoke and to implement some of these policy proposals. And so I think it's important, as I said, to lay the basis and then do the policy.
Well, I think that's brilliant. And because if I can't tell you how many times I have to explain to people, even adults on social media, the difference between federal jurisdictions and provincial, right? Because there's a blurring, and people just don't know what's within the municipal bandwidth and what's provincial and what's federal, and who to blame for what if you're displeased, and who to advocate to if you want change, right? So I love that. And my guest on the most recent Oshow was Kathleen Wynne, the former premier, and she's big into education. So we had a bit of a geek out deep dive into communication and politics and education in 2025 and what that should look like, especially with provincial and federal elections coming up, Wyatt. It's going to be a lot to talk about. But the idea of getting high school students engaged at the civics level to understand those structures and then to understand where they have power. Where can you make this beyond just a fight on TikTok for 2 hours and into something where you can protect the environment and protect your future rights, etc. I think is a great way to go about it. So where can our guests find you, our viewers, our listeners who might not already be watching the Wyatt Sharpe show?
Yeah, it's all social media, Wyatt Sharpe, and you can just go on, and in some cases there'll be little clips of interviews I do. Sometimes it's, trips that I took to meet or interview with, a certain politician. And so, next month I'll be in Washington for the inauguration, which will be interesting to say the least. And so, but yeah, all social media.
And are you going to be working with CNN on the inauguration, or is that yet to be announced who you'll be covering it for?
I haven't exactly figured. So how it works is you apply for media credentials from like the joint inaugural committee. And so for that, I applied on behalf of the News Forum, which is a Canadian organization. And then sometimes like when I'm there, like for example, the debate, I did a whole host of different things. Like it was Fox, it was News Nation, CBC, CTV. Just because our Canadian media market is often smaller than the American market, and they aren't able to send like correspondents to some of these really big events because they just don't have the resources to do so. So if I'm there, then maybe they'll like ask me to do a segment or something. And so, yeah, just kind of a whole bunch of things mixed in. And then, of course, stuff for my own show as well. With the inauguration, it's interesting, though, because I think like all the Canadian media are there, all the international media are there. And it's kind of this one time where aside from the two conventions that happen over the summer in the election year itself, where there's a bunch of international media all interested in a political event happening in another country.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. And I see you proudly displaying all your lanyards in the background. I love your passion for journalism. And, as I see journalism schools, including the one I went to, shutting down their programs, perhaps this is the future of journalism in our country. But you are approaching it, Wyatt, from what I can tell, in the best way possible, which is you're curious, but you are open-minded to what you're going to learn. And I think that's the best way to engage people into the conversation, is to bring them the information, bring them the access to the decision makers, and have them understand the issues. So I wish you the very best, and maybe we'll tap you again around the time of the inauguration to have you back and get your takes on everything. Given that the future is going to be up to your generation, I think it's incredibly important for the rest of us to hear how you see it and what you're doing to move the conversation forward. Thank you so much for being on the Oshow, Wyatt. And people should also subscribe to your YouTube channel to make sure that you get the latest from Wyatt. And as he said, he's on all the socials as well. Thanks for being on the Oshow.
Thank you.
When you care about current affairs, it's on the Oshow. And when you want to get clear what's going on here, it's on the Oshow. If you like to stay in the know, tune yourself into the Oshow. It's the Oshow. Laura Babcock's the Oshow. With a lot of great guests, she puts them to the test on the Oshow. There's no doubt they'll be calling them out on the Oshow. Stand for something or fall for it all. Ontario, hear the call on the Oshow. It's a podcast, the Oshow. Laura Babcock's the Oshow. Stay informed with the Oshow, Oshow.
Your merch band.